Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I'm Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. Welcome to Ream Library, our home. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, special events, exhibits. We help do the exhibits in the Cantor Gallery now on issues that explore meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can find most of our talks online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, as in a couple of days today's talk will be. So you can go home and tell your friends what they missed and to tune in online. One of the McFarland Center's most significant initiatives is the programming offered under the aegis of the Kraft-Hiatt Fund for Jewish-Christian Understanding, made possible by the late Jacob Hiatt and his wife Leah Hiatt, and the Kraft family as well, his Jacob's daughter Myra and son-in-law Robert, who very generously gave us the Kraft-Hiatt Chair in Jewish Studies and provided some funds for us to do some programming on Judaism and Jewish-Christian understanding. Through the fund, we've been able to enrich teaching and learning on Jewish life, the Shoah, and Jewish-Christian relations. The programs enabled our faculty to spend time at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, doing other kinds of research that enrich teaching, and developing their teaching competencies and research understanding. We've sent students to study abroad at Hebrew University, and we've brought in distinguished scholars for classroom visits and public lectures like this one. Alan Rosen, our speaker today, was here in a number of classes yesterday and today. If I can put in a plug, next Monday, November 6th at 7:30, I'd invite you to join us for a talk by Seth Stevens-Davidowitz, a former Google data scientist, on anti-Semitism and the internet. Stevens-Davidowitz is fairly famous for plunging into big data and looking at what people think and say and explore from the privacies of their computer. So you can look at those. He's all sorts of intersectional questions about racism and the like, and he'll talk to us very specifically about anti-Semitism. Next semester, we'll explore contemporary anti-Semitism more deeply with lectures by Charles Asher Small, director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, and Katya Gibel-Mevarach, an anthropologist at Grinnell, who will address anti-Semitism with a focus on intersectionality. You can go to our website, as I mentioned, holycross.edu/McFarland Center for more information on the event and to watch those past lectures. Over the years, we've been really fortunate, 10 years, to host Alan Rosen. Alan is a rabbi, a renowned scholar of Holocaust literature. He speaks and works with our students while he's here. As I said to Father Burroughs a few minutes ago, every time he gets involved in a class and meets some more people, there's one more set of people who want to meet Alan and bring him into class. He's had a great effect on our students when he's been here. And because of that, we're happy to welcome back in a new role this year for the first time as our Kraft-Hiatt Scholar-in-Residence. Dr. Rosen's been visiting classes for the last couple of days, and this afternoon we'll speak on Jewish religious life and practice during and after the Holocaust. Dr. Rosen is a lecturer at Yad Vashem and has held fellowships at the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD in literature and religion from Boston University, where he studied under the supervision of the late Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel. He's taught Holocaust literature at colleges and universities in Israel and in the United States. Dr. Rosen is author of The Wonder of Their Voices, the 1946 Holocaust Interviews with David Boder, published in 2010, Sounds of Defiance, The Holocaust, Multilingualism, and the Problem of English, and Dislocating the End, Climax, Closure, and the Invention of Genre. He's editor of a number of collections reflecting on Elie Wiesel's work. So please join me in welcoming Alan Rosen.
We all need rain. Rain is that which allows the earth to give forth the food, the bounty we need. That need for rain is reflected within the prayer life of a Jew. that on the holiday of Sukkot, we begin to pray for rain. And that prayer for rain is then intensified later in the year during the central prayer of the Jewish liturgy, the Shemona Esrei prayer. When in early December, that one inserts a nuanced change in that prayer that goes from v'tein bracha, and to give blessing, and shifts in the season of rain to v'tein tal umatar, which means to give dew and rain that should come to the earth. And this is understood, despite its nuanced minutia of the prayer, to be fundamental in bringing enough rain for us to live, survive, and thrive. This is all a prelude then to an experience of mine, and an experience far more important during the time of the Holocaust, the Shoah. 2 years ago, I was on a plane, as I sometimes am, from Tel Aviv to New York. Sitting to my left was one Lazar Bornstein, Rabbi Lazar Bornstein, a Gerer Chassid. And he was one of the most convivial plane companions I've ever had the pleasure to meet in beautiful ways. He was also learning up a storm on the plane, completely unsilenced by the normal codes of that one should be demure, and singing different Hasidic melodies on the plane, which he encouraged me to join in, and I did sometimes. And then he asked me what I did. I told him I lecture on the Holocaust, and I was working on a book, which I lectured on here a few years ago, and the book is, God willing, to come out this year, on Holocaust-era calendars. And he said, "Oh, do I have a story for you?" So he said, my uncle was in the Lodz ghetto, and he was part of a group of Ger Hasidim, of a particular stream of Hasidic Jewry that thrived in Poland, thrived in the Lodz ghetto, and thank God has rebuilt today in great quantity and quality. And my uncle was there, he said, and he and several colleagues were discovered hiding in a bunker. They were arrested, taken because they were believed, even though they were learning Torah, they were believed to be spies. They were taken and interrogated in serious ways, which meant beatings and blood. Each boy, and they were boys in their late teens, to separate rooms. There then was a pause in the beatings, and they were to be taken back to prison. And as his uncle, he told me, Lazar Bernstein, passed another boy, Rabbi Moshe Liss, in the hall. Moshe Liss turns around and he says, with blood on his face, "Remember, tomorrow we start saying Tal Umatar." And I, as he said that, almost jumped out of my seat, and I said, I know that story. He looks at me, how do you know that story? I said, because that's told in a book by Rabbi Moshe Prager, who's on the bibliography that I handed out, called Those Who Did Not Yield. And he tells the story in the name of the uncle who survived the war. So that was precious to hear from, not a book which has its own merits, but from one of the descendants to whom that story had been passed down. And the story, of course, centers around a small fragment of a prayer that in the midst of beatings, in the midst of the outrageousness of being imprisoned in a ghetto, a communal prison, that these boys found to be still at the forefront of their mind, the forefront of their consciousness, the forefront of their spiritual life. Beatings or no beatings, that was the agenda. So we have the privilege to study together briefly an epic subject, which is the religious Jewish life and practice during and after the Holocaust. Which we'll do is really an introduction to the subject, a great, awesome subject of fidelity of Jews to the remarkable spiritual life that in normal times is pursued with vigor, but during the times of crisis and sorrow, such as the Holocaust, are pursued with even if one can say it, a greater tenacity. So before continuing, please let me thank the Kraft-Hiatt Center, Professor Tom Landy, the other members of the Kraft-Hiatt Committee, for this being what I calculate at least being my 10th year in having the privilege to come to this college and to have my really extraordinary colleagues share their outstanding students with me, to collaborate in classes. I learn a great deal, so I relish the opportunity, and special thanks to them, to the college in general, for supporting this, and look forward to continuing, intensifying, expanding in the future, God willing. In order to do justice to this subject, we have to make a brief detour into the normal life of a religious Jew, which to some people here is the life that they live, but probably to most of those in attendance is something that is not just secondhand or to be taken for granted. The normal practice, as I'm calling it, of an observant Jew is such to begin the very first thing in the morning when one wakes up with a prayer known as Modeh, that even before one gets out of bed, before one flexes an elbow, one has a commandment to say this prayer modani, which means, I thank you, God, for returning my soul to me. So the very day is inaugurated before anything else with a prayer of thanks. And that's really a launching of the day. This and the other normal practices that we'll briefly review are all guided by several manuals that set forth the 613 commandments that an observant Jew must fulfill. Not all of them in a day, of course, and not every Jew fulfills all of them, but 613 are on the books, we can say, which we've heard about the 10 commandments that Moses received on Mount Sinai. But he actually, believe it or not, received 613, which were elaborated in the 5 books of Moses themselves, and then by the sages in the Mishnah and Talmud commentaries. And that is what articulates our daily practice, including this prayer modani. One then washes their hands to remove the impurities that may have come during the time of sleep. One then says a series of morning blessings after getting dressed, so on. For Jewish men, there is then, as part of the prayer service, which takes place, the morning prayer service, which takes place either in the home or in the synagogue, there is the putting on of a talit, which is distinguished by ritual fringes, both a talit that's worn under one's outer garments, sometimes kind of over, there's a dispute on this, and a larger talit that covers one to enhance one's prayers. And then also putting on what are called tefillin, in which the prayer Shema Israel that we'll talk about more is enclosed, and then a Jewish man is ready for prayer. Jewish woman also is obligated to pray, but her sensitivities are considered to be at a higher rung than a man's, and these aids, as it were, are not essential for her prayers to receive the full momentum that is needed to be able to do one's utmost to reach God with prayer. After prayer, one would eat, one does eat, and included in that eating are kosher food that is distinguished by a somewhat complex set of guidelines, that is preceded fore and aft by a series of blessings that invoke God's recognition of God as being the source of these foods. One studies, and so sacred books are part and parcel of an observant Jew's life through the day. Then there is an afternoon prayer, dinner, more study, and an evening prayer. Observant Jews pray 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And then before going to bed, there's a counterpart to the prayers in the morning, which guide one's way to sleep, with again thanks to the Almighty for that. There are also then, in normal Jewish practice, life cycle events that are crucial, that of when a baby is born, to name a baby girl in the synagogue, and usually to have a celebration in the weeks that follow, and for a boy to have a ritual circumcision on the 8th day, known in Hebrew as a brit milah or bris milah. At the age of 3, in many communities, a boy will have his first hair cutting, and there's different associations with the specialness of that, introducing the boy to the study of Torah, the going to school first day, as we celebrate that in general society, also in Jewish society. At the age of 12, for a Jewish girl, becomes what's called a bat mitzvah, where she's obligated in these 613 commandments. At the age of 13, a boy reaches that age. And then there is weddings, and the cycle continues again with children and grandchildren, God willing, and then a series of special commandments associated with illness and then death. The around death, that the special guidelines for funeral, Jews must be buried, not cremated. The Torah tells us that a person is formed out of dust and returns to dust. And so that's understood with a number of other guidelines to have a Jew be buried. And in the wake of that, to sit Shiva, to go through a week of mourning, which then for parents are extended to a year, and that brings dignity to the memory of the departed. Finally, along with that, are the observances that are consecrated in time. Holidays. We love holidays. They are the spice, really the spice of living, that punctuate and break up and the mundane life, that no matter how good the work is, that come to raise that work in our own spirits to a new level. So in the Jewish calendar, the holidays are particularly in the fall, a month of saturated with the holidays of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the Day of Atonement, the holiday of Sukkot, the holiday of rejoicing of the Torah, and then soon on our horizon is the holiday, 8-day holiday of Hanukkah, in the spring Purim and Passover, and in the late spring, early summer, the holiday of Shavuot. And all of those bring a cessation of work in order to be able to focus on spiritual activities. And that for a Jew, that cessation from work and focus on spiritual takes place every week with the Sabbath day, which begins at dusk on Friday evening and goes till dusk on Saturday. And during that time, one ceases from all mundane labor and then has time to study more, pray longer, have sumptuous meals, which then put one in an expansive mood to be able to relish more fully God's gifts. And along with that are a fixed and sometimes innovative retinue of songs that adorn each of these special days. So this, in brief, is an overview of a normal Jewish practice lived in Europe by Jews of many different origins, many different backgrounds, from Germany, France, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and then into Eastern Europe of Russia, the Baltic countries, Ukraine, Poland. This was normal. And beginning then with at first the rise to power of the fascists in Germany in 1933, the Nuremberg laws that then came unfolded during the 1930s in Germany, brought discrimination, stigmatization to the Jews of Germany. And then when the World War II began on September 1st, 1939, Polish Jewry was terrorized by the invaders, and then that soon spread to other Jewries in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, until most of Europe was under occupation. And what had been normal Jewish practice was no longer normal. Every aspect had to be fought for, struggled for, earned, because of the restrictions, the terrorizing of the enemy, the shortage of supplies, and the depression that the war and the oppression brought. So what did Jews do in response? We heard already about the delicate staying with that prayer for rain, even in the midst of being beaten and bloodied. That what we call in Hebrew Yeshuv Hadas, that composure to not let the enemy set the terms. And that was true with other Jewish practices as well. So, for prayer, for example, even though prayer was terribly restricted by the enemy, there was every effort to be able to maintain a order of prayer in one's life, in one's community, and that can be kind of felt in this remarkable report about the having a prayer book and caring for a prayer book and fashioning a prayer book when prayer books were banned and could, if one was discovered with one, could put one in a life-risking situation. So this report, written by a Jew in Poland, reads as follows: I carry along with me on my odyssey through all the concentration camps this unique prayer book. It helps me get relief every time fear and darkness descend upon me. It carries to me the message that it's possible to be sunk in abysmal misery and yet to do as Moshe Baruchchov from Zelikov near Warsaw did. In the hard times that pass over me, I turn the pages of that prayer book. I look at them and see them crowded with prayers, letters guarded more than any treasure in the world. And I'm full of wonder at the holy and bold simplicity of this ordinary Jew, Moshe Barokovich. I'm sorry I mispronounced it the first time, of Zelikov. At the time of danger and threatening ultimate destruction, the worry that preoccupied him was that the world might be left without a Jewish prayer book. And the holy martyrs, thus without remembrance. So he, Moshe Barokovich, took it upon himself to write from memory this prayer book, to make sure that in a world that was being eviscerated of Jews in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, that a Jewish prayer book should continue to exist, to be used, yes, to be recited, yes, with the prayer Modeh Ani that we talked about before, with the Shema Yisrael prayer that we'll talk about in a minute, but that the prayer book itself, as a symbol of a Jew's devotion to God, should exist materially. The Shema Yisrael prayer says that, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That's a prayer the Jews are commanded to say once in the morning, once at night. In proclaiming, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," it's understood to make a statement that I submit to God as my Lord. That is the fundamental element of Jewish prayer. So this prayer was invoked from memory often during the time of the Holocaust. It is also a prayer that one is responsible, to whatever degree they have the strength, responsible to say in one's last moments of life, proclaiming as one enters the gateway to another world, that, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So it is said that even under terrible examples of oppression in the ghettos of Eastern Europe, in the concentration and death camps of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, the Jews endeavored, even as they were being forced to submit to the rule and the murderous intent of the enemy, invoked this prayer. So the Rabbi Menachem Mendel Taub was known as the Koliver Rebbe, lives in Jerusalem, age approximately 95. As a teenager, was deported from Hungary to Auschwitz. And even though he survived Auschwitz, he did so only at the cost of having undergone brutal medical experiments that prevented him from then having children. And even more conspicuously, but not more importantly, but more conspicuously, in a world of Eastern European Hasidic leaders, of which he is a great one, those experiments prevented him from growing a beard. So he stands out in every photograph of prestigious leaders who have beards that might make mine appear scrawny and short. And he has none. But he said, in his time there, he saw Jews that underwent not only experiments, but worse, who invoked this prayer of Shema Yisrael. So he's made it then his life calling as a way to honor that prayer, to at every time he speaks, whatever audience, he always ends by having the audience say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, as a memorial to those who invoke this prayer under all circumstances. And you may remember in Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, how many of you are familiar with that book? Some number, a great memoir written by a psychiatrist who was deported from Vienna to concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And he, you might remember that his wife and mother were separated from him. And he also, when they were deported, had taken a manuscript that he had worked on for years of his life's work, put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and when he arrived at Auschwitz, was made like the other prisoners, to strip of his clothes. And at that point, he underwent a depression that he thought would overwhelm him, that he had lost everything meaningful in the world. His wife, his mother, his manuscript. He took the clothes then that were given him with such a heavy heart, he reports. And then he felt against his chest something rubbing. And he reached in to his pocket where his manuscript had been in the coat that he disrobed. And he says he pulled out a page from a Jewish prayer book. And on that page was the prayer, Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And he said that revolutionized his entire experience. That he realized that what he had felt to be a loss was actually now to be seen as something that was being substituted to give him guidance in giving meaning to all of his experience, loss included. The holidays, which are so much in Jewish life, as they are in general life, a time of warmth, of family, of sumptuous food, often, and of joy and song, that in the ghettos and concentration camps could be observed again at risk to one's life, and the supplies to be able to do that were minuscule. So on the Sabbath day, that is usually heralded by the lighting of candles for the entry, a sumptuous meal at night, special prayers, a sumptuous meal again in the day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and prayers in between, and study and family time was impossible. It wasn't allowed for the most part. In fact, it was scorned by the enemy. And so one could observe only at risk to one's life. Furthermore, that on the Sabbath day one has to cease from work. And there's a complex set of guidelines for exactly what that entails. But one had to, in ghettos and camps, work, or else one was vulnerable to deportation, or worse, immediately. But there were Jews who endeavored not to work at those jobs, who endeavored to say the special prayers, and one particular unbelievably imaginative example comes from a memoir of a Dutch Jew, Yona Emanuel. The memoir is called Dignity to Survive. Extraordinary book of his and his family's time in the concentration camps of Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen. And he talks about how in Westerbork, in Holland, where they had to go to work on the Sabbath day, and for someone for whom this was completely alien to his nature, it felt impossible. And for someone who always wore the special set of Sabbath clothes that one has reserved only for that day, not to be able to work not to be able to wear them, but to have to wear work garments, was a desecration of the sacredness that moved the Jewish life to purpose, to the calling that a Jew has. So what did he and some of his colleagues do? They wore on the Sabbath day the only pair of clean undergarments that they had, and then put their work clothes above. And those undergarments, which he himself reflects on as such a conflict in himself to have to wear underneath, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was an honoring of the Sabbath day that the enemy could do nothing to undermine. And for the holidays, there were few supplies. There was little that could be garnered. So during Passover, as you might know, one of the central mitzvot, central symbols, central commandments, is for a Jew to eat unleavened bread, matzah, that recollects the exodus from Egypt. And there was no matzah to be bought, no matzah to be made in ghettos generally, though in the Lodz ghetto there was some. In other ghettos there were various clever ways to find flour to be able to use for making of matzah. So it was not impossible, but very unlikely in ghettos to have the proportions that one needed. And in concentration camps, even much more difficult. So Pearl Banish, in a memoir called Vanquish the Dragon, writes about her time in Bergen-Belsen. That first Seder night in 1944, Passover of 1944, and the special ritual meal then, that Luba, her friend, glanced at the table and gasped. There, miracle of miracles, lay matzah, a real matzah. Here I am, a palpable miracle, a real matzah for Seder in Bergen-Belsen. One little miracle had already occurred. It was lying on the table. Then a greater one took place. And here is her own infusion of the spirit of undauntedness that she found. Then a greater miracle took place there in the pitch darkness in Bergen-Belsen, a group of women ravaged with typhus said the blessing, "Blessed are you, O Lord, King of the universe, who has given us this mitzvah, this commandment of eating the matzah." The very fact that one could invoke such a blessing under these conditions was a greater miracle than, to her mind, than the acquisition of the physical object. To have the holidays, to observe the holidays, to follow the holidays, it took having a Jewish calendar, which I've spoken about here in years past in my book called Keeping Time Sacred, Making Time Holy, elaborates. But there are just two instances that I want to mention of calendars made during the Holocaust that guided Jews to when the date was that one had to observe these holidays in whatever form they could possibly be observed. So one is a calendar made of, in all places, the Auschwitz concentration camp by a 20-year-old woman named Sophie Zollberg, who, thank God, lives in a Jerusalem suburb today, survived the camp. And she had been trained in grade school by an outstanding teacher, Julius Kissinger, who's a cousin to Henry, who you might have heard of. And her teacher, Julius Kissinger, was so scrupulous in teaching the rudiments of making a Jewish calendar that 10 years later, she could use the guidelines to make her own in Auschwitz, one in the year 5704, 1943, 1944, and one for the following year. And she did this, she said, so the women that she was among in the workplace where she survived, whether it was like herself doing the laundry of the undergarments of the SS, or like her friend and colleague Annalisa Borinsky, mending those same clothes, the 100 or 150 women there needed, she felt, to have the guidance to know when a holiday fell. So even if they couldn't observe in full, even if observance had to be abbreviated, they could at least know. So the calendar that she made is today in her living room in a box, small jewelry box, with a small prayer book that she also had from those days. She was able to secrete, and with the French flags, very, very astonishingly, the French flags that she and other women put on their dress after the war, so that the Russian soldiers who were liberating would not take them for Germans and carry out revenge against them. And those are together with her. And the second example of the calendar is every bit as extraordinary. There was a family named Orvieto, Jewish family in Rome, who, when they vacationed by the shore during the summers in the early 1940s, had made friends with a local priest named Don Tantolo. When it became clear in 1944 that the Jews of Rome were going to be rounded up after Germany had taken over Italy, that they fled to the countryside and fled to his village, asking him to take them in, which he did. They and another family, and they survived the war there. But more than that, he, who was a Philo-Semite, clearly of the highest kind, wanted to make his dwelling completely at home for these Jewish families, helping them observe the Sabbath days, but also the holidays. So on Passover, he took it upon himself to, in a place where there were no Jews, to acquire matzah, and not only that, to get for them a new set of dishes and cutlery, because that's on Passover what you have to do. And furthermore, because they fled Rome already at a time that they didn't have a calendar for that year, he took it upon himself to make a Jewish calendar that would indicate for them when they should observe Passover. And they did. After the war, he became sick with tuberculosis, and the Orvieto family helped to pay the expenses for his treatment until he passed away shortly thereafter. There are many other examples with every facet of Jewish life and also with Jewish death. As we spoke about before, that there's a special cadre of rituals that attend taking care of the dead, ways of going to death, to purify the corpse of a Jew, readying for burial, and burial must be made. But even in those cases that it couldn't, that particular steps were taken. So there's an account given of Rabbi Mendel Alter, who was the brother of the leader of the Ger Hasidim of the time, that he was in Treblinka, terribly, the death center that murdered most of the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, of whom he was one. And he realized that his end was coming, and he desperately asked one of the Jewish kapos for a glass of water, for a cup of water. And the Jew, for some reason, responded, brought it to him thinking, okay, he wants to slake his thirst before the end. Last request, I'll honor. And so he took the water and he washed his hands as an act of purification before delivering his soul back to his Creator, and said to the other Jews that were there, it's now time to say the Shema Yisrael. Also, Rabbi Shlomo Rabinovich of Radomsk, who made sure that he would not be deported, but rather in the Warsaw Ghetto, but rather go to a normal death, was shot and was buried in the Jewish cemetery because he was so determined that he should have a Jewish burial, that he refused the enemy's call to march to the deportation place. Rabbi Bloch in the Lithuanian town of Tels, who, knowing that the end would come, he called for his oldest daughter to study with him the code of laws that Maimonides, the great codifier of the Jews, has for the mitzvah, the commandment of Kiddush Hashem, of giving one's life to God to honor Him at even the final moments. And they studied for weeks on end so they would be sure to carry that out with enormous fidelity, which he did, and she, thank God, escaped. And finally, Rabbi Meisels, in a very different circumstance, Rabbi Tzvi Meisels, in Auschwitz on the day before Rosh Hashanah of 1944, was approached by a father of a boy who was one of the boys to be collected for murder on the next day, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year of 1944. And the father asked the rabbi the following question, which is common among Jews, to approach rabbis to ask questions of clarification to gain wisdom. His question was not common, though. He said to the rabbi, I'm an administrator of the camp. I have the option in my position of removing my son from the group of boys who will be slaughtered tomorrow, but that will mean that another boy needs to be inserted in his place because they have to have a full number. Said, am I allowed, according to Jewish teachings, to remove my son and substitute another? And the rabbi was overwhelmed by the question. He had no colleagues to consult. He had no books to check. He felt himself standing over an abyss. So he reports that he couldn't answer. The father asked again. He remained silent. The father said, I take it that the rabbi's response, since he did not say that I could undertake such an act, means that I cannot. He says, may it be in praise of the Lord that I followed the teachings that the rabbi has guided me to. And he left his son in that group of boys. So even at the final moments, did Jews see that the sacred terms of the Torah, of Jewish practice and law, guided activities in the most unsacred of places? In the aftermath of the war, there was a fervent activity of memorializing and rebuilding. Schools, synagogues, books, families. In the DP camps, the displaced persons camps of Germany, the birth rate, after the scores of marriages, the birth rate there in these displaced persons camps was the highest in the world, replenishing the Jewish world that had been so decimated. There were also, in all communities, plaques with names of those who had perished. Also on the furnishings of the synagogue, also on Torah scrolls. And each one, when a name was written, it was followed by the acronym Hayad, which one can still very much see, very much present in Jewish surroundings. Hayad. which means the Almighty will avenge their blood. And it's written after the name of those who were martyred through murder. And it's a way of understanding that those events continue to be within God's purview, and justice will come through God's own activities. So I began by talking about the privilege of sitting next to Rabbi Lazar Bornstein on the plane, his convivial conversation, his singing, his telling me the story of his uncle in the Lodz ghetto, being called to by Rabbi Moshe List, tomorrow remember to say Tal Umatar in the prayers, and that nuanced sense of composure, that the enemy should not set the terms, guided in virtually every situation Jewish practice. And I have to say that I knew that story, as I mentioned. But as I sat next to Rabbi Lazar Bornstein, and he told me, it shifted. The sands of meaning changed for me. It was no longer a story. It was rather a witnessed account that I had been privileged and, I have to say, sent to be able to hear from one who heard it from one who was there. And one of the great blessings of the response that we have is the way that testimony has come from almost every quarter of the Jewish world, telling of these extraordinary exploits of religious practice within the life cycle, within the holidays. And they can only make us tremble. Thank you very much. So, questions, comments, please. Thank you for your good attention. But there must be questions of any kind. There's no wrong questions to be asked. Never a wrong question. Yeah, it's Steffi asked, could everyone hear there's, in addition to Kiddush Hashem, Kiddush means to sanctify. Hashem is the reference to God. So sanctifying God, usually it's thought of in this way, sanctifying by giving up one's life, by becoming a martyr. So Steffi asked, what about the term Kiddush HaChaim? That Rabbi Nissenbaum, I believe, in the Warsaw Ghetto, coined the phrase, and that by the struggling to survive, and to do that especially through Jewish means, was its own kind of sanctification of God. If I'm understanding correctly, Steffi, yes? And so you asked, are those connected with one another, or are they separate? So I think that there's different ways in which they're I think that they're connected as dating back to Jewish responses that go further back in history than the Holocaust, that are both ways of sanctifying God through observing God's commandments. In other words, the Kiddush HaChaim was also a way of observing commandments that may not initially choose or submit to martyrdom, but rather try to preserve life. And that too is a commandment, that there are most situations where one is commanded to violate Jewish practice. One is called upon not to place one's life at risk. So that too is inspired by following the Torah and God's commands. So I really see them as two different prongs of the overall response that has been that of Jewish activity during times of crisis, dating back far into history. Does that address the question? Yeah? Thank you. I think it can be deeply theological, but it can also be, as I hear you asking, experiential. Meaning, not everyone acted with the utmost heroism, because I can't imagine that I would have. And the circumstances were such that the practice, what I talked about as being normal practice, was reduced incredibly for most of the Jews who were observant, practicing Jews. So that to speak about, as I did, this practice as being in a certain way not normal but normative at the same time, does probably doesn't do justice to the difficult situation, which is all an understatement, the Jews faced, and the challenges to both practice and faith that came then. So I think you're right that I probably underdescribed that, and I've criticized Rabbi Berkowitz for doing exactly the same thing. But I still think it's how do I justify myself? I still think that it's important to have an idea of the struggle to maintain whatever fragments of normal practice could be maintained. And that itself is a way to honor what may not have been, full practice or full faith, but even fragmented practice and fragmented faith has, I think, its right to be honored. There was a lot of dynamic movement among the communities as they were brought together, meaning that, as for example, Primo Levi describes his arrival in Auschwitz being coming into contact with a religious Jewish life that he had never seen or experienced before. And even though he didn't transform himself into such a Jew, that he still was affected and I think influenced by that. And that's only one example, of course, of many. but I think that the understanding that there were basic practices that were shared, those of prayer and study among Jews from whichever place in Europe, still allowed for an idiom of communication, even if the language itself was not shared. So that there could be a value in a sacred book being preserved, for example, in Hebrew, even though the two people or two groups of people could not communicate orally together, they could pray from the same prayer book because they shared that idiom. So the underlying structure of those of Jews from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, I think, from what I've seen, allowed that kind of common concern. The relation between the religious Jews of, for example, of Poland or Hungary, coming into contact with Western Jews from France and Italy there were tensions, clearly, because they lived by different sets of values. But there were ways that, even though they didn't simply become homogenized, by no means, I think, that there were, again, these ways in which religious practice lent themselves to a respect and an embrace in certain areas. So the example of Viktor Frankl that I gave is one. In other words, Viktor Frankl himself was an assimilated Jew from Vienna, so the discovery of the Shema Yisrael and prayer in his pocket, substituting for his manuscript, it doesn't, on the face of it, seem like a very fair exchange from those set of values. But he, in a way, was expanded as he reports it, which again doesn't mean that he became a completely different kind of Jew. He didn't. But he did find a set of terms himself that allowed for the experience of an assimilated Jew like himself and a religious Jew like those from Hungary, Poland, could be appreciated for the meaningfulness that they gave to even experiences of great oppression and loss. So, I mean, I'm just now wondering that his own finding of logotherapy, as he called it, his style, his form of therapy and of thinking, would have come to the surface had not that encounter with religious elements had taken place. So I think within the focus of my talk tonight, it's not so much talking about the uniform meaningfulness of these practices for every Jew in every Jewish community, but the meaningfulness that it had for those that were given to have them in their normal practice, and some other kind of value that they had for even Jews who were not used to having them as their normal daily practice. So there's much more to say, and I think it's a very good follow-up to Professor Avery Peck's question, so thank you for it. Maybe one more question? So Talmud is the word for study, from the root to study, and it refers to the set of teachings codified by sages in approximately the 5th century of the Common Era that are commentaries on the Torah, the Bible, the Jewish Bible, that then take that is a mixture of guidelines for practice as well as stories to furnish suggested meaning of the practice and endeavor of being a Jew. So the Talmud is that set of books, of volumes that continue to be the chief source of Jewish practice from that time forward till our own day today. Is that helpful in that way? Yeah? Great. So thank you all for coming and studying together, and good questions, and look forward to studying again.